So I've been asked by Pierre to chair this session, which is called, let me open the program. Oh, there's no name. What's the name of the session? History. Last session. I think it has to do with historical approaches. I think that word was there. So there are three fantastic scholars in this session, so I'll read aspects of their bio. There's so much to say about each of them. So the first is Professor Alessandra Campana from Tufts University. She works on the interfaces of hearing and seeing in theater, film, and video. Trained as a cultural and music historian, she has worked on the staging and spectatorship of opera in Italy at the turn of the 20th century, but also on the interaction of staging practices with music in Mozart, Bellini, Donizetti, Verdi, Boito, and Puccini. She's currently completing a book on film, where she argues that film soundtracks may work to destabilize the central positioning of the viewer-hearer as posed by classic film theory. She's a member of the editorial team of the Opera Quarterly, co-chair of, she's part of so many different groups that are doing fantastic work on behalf of, in the promotion of opera studies. The title of her talk is quite enigmatic. So I'm very curious, 22 grams, the enigma of the public. So please, let's welcome her warmly.
Thank you. Thank you for organizing this fantastic event and occasion to discuss without conclusions. I completely endorse that. And so I want to start by positing that opera is part of a system involving the audience, and thus as such are always already this-centered. Opera here is not just the work, but also spectacle, entertainment, cultural commodity, social event, aesthetic object, historical subject. And yet, the effort to encompass the audience in the study of opera is and has been rather resistant to musicological toolboxes, old and new, countered by more or less overt disciplinary minefields, marred by a complicated no relationship between the what and the how, the qualitative and the quantitative, as testified, for example, by the often decried failure reception studies, or the vagueness of spectatorship, which is what I did, on the brink of apparatus theory. Even when studied from the purview of the culture industry and its effort to control and foresee the effect of opera, the audience remains an unforeseeable variable. To borrow from Amanda Lotz, a TV studies scholar, part of the Spreadable Media Research Group at MIT, she says, entertainment-based media industries have to acknowledge their fundamental difference, a difference captured in the maxim, and this is what she says, nobody knows, which results from the fickleness of the audience. So, if the audience is the supplement to the event, to the work, and to the cultural commodity, it has been and continues to be fundamentally inscrutable. Addressed, entertained as maintained within by the event and by the work, and yet unfathomable, demanding to be measured and yet unmeasurable, the terminological slippage, audience, public, fans, points to the collective identity of a multitude which is always in a state of becoming, as it is caught in a moment of reaction to the work. This paper advances that because of its relation to opera, the audience must remain inscrutable. Its power resides precisely in its enigmatic force, in all its singular, collective, immanent, and material manifestations. This formulation serves as a starting point to outline a line of inquiry that weaves in and out of a few historical documents and theoretical observations in pursuit of the audience's enigmatic centrality. The first section offers a rereading of a couple of emblematic samples from the Milanese press at the end of the 19th century, which is a field I kind of explored more than a decade ago for my first book. while the last section dwells on two rather different vignettes, symptomatic of a 20th century disquiet about the affective transaction between opera and fans. If we consider opera as always entangled in a relation with the audience, then the opus, the work, the event on stage, ought to be studied as the activation of an aesthetic relation, encompassing the sociality upon which such relation is founded. If modern Western art theory has been much occupied with the act of creation, so studied composer, creative process, and with the product of creation, the work, and so forth, now it would be the time to reintegrate creation and aesthesis. Moreover, opera would consist of an always contingent cultural practice and demand a historiography that is capable of destabilizing conventional parsing and hierarchy of text versus context. Such hierarchy still informs most textbook narratives of opera and of music more broadly, premised as they are on the very operation of contextualizing the work, which is of building a background to the foreground of music. Rather, an opera in a relation with the audience will become the context to the audience as the very medium by which the collective subjectivity, in a Gramscian formulation, in the theater becomes an audience, or more precisely here, becomes a public. Consequently, the relation established by the aesthetic encounter also skews the reification of the work into an atemporal, ahistorical object of scholarship, and begs instead for a historiography capable of accounting for this radical contingency. In preparation for the 1881 National Exhibition in Milan, the press and publishing industry was charged with the task of informing the national and international visitors on the marvels of Italian industry and art. Please try again. Sorry, I'm activating Siri, which never understands me, so it's really odd. The marvels of Italian industry and art. Some of the most prestigious writers of the times were commissioned with the task of describing Milanese artistic institutions. The rhetoric of these publications is oddly wavering between unabashed marketing and folk ethnography. Here, the audience of opera comes to the fore as one of the assets of Milanese cultural life and is consistently referenced as the public. The guide to the exhibition includes Fontana's long essay on Milanese theaters, and here you have an excerpt. A prominent journalist and staple of the local literary scene for at least 20 years, Fontana, right at the outset, clarifies the epistemological position of his account, declaring that rather than statistics or lists of dates and titles, he informs the visitor with sketches, physiologies, caricatures. In what follows, the La Scala Theatre is described in its social function. Its position as the first theatre in Milan is validated not by appeal to abstract notions of cultural primacy, prestige, fame, and so forth, but by its role in structuring the discourse of social life. And you can see at the very beginning here, to me, hardly a theatre lover, La Scala has always been more or less a nightmare. La Scala occupies 2/3, to say the least, of the life of Milanese people, which, considering all other topics worthy of human thought, seems truly too much. And so forth. In the very end, the last 3 lines, if you place 3 Milanese people in the middle of the Sahara Desert, after an hour they would be found brooding over the things of La Scala. So in this vignette, the audience is a public insofar as its very sociality is mediated by the discourse about the theater's production system and the theater as an institution. The writer assumes a position of externality that allows him to adopt the ironic distance of the ethnographer dealing with native costumes. Hence the emphasis on the oddly excessive bandwidth occupied by the things of La Scala. The theater occupies an abstract yet substantial space in the overall attention and affective economy of the city. The programmatic detachment emerges immediately after the passage quoted above, when the effective investment is measured against what for him is a desublimated reality. But after all, what does this such worrisome La Scala amount to? It is a theater like any other, and then of course it's worse than any other, right? Here Fontana still adopts a well-rehearsed post-unitarian rhetoric of modernization, where Italianness is always defined by comparison to greener grasses. Puzzling, perhaps, is the tone. The prose, with all its witty sarcasm, constitutes a specific kind of performance for the benefit of the tourist. Ethnicization of social life and reification of opera going become the cultural capital advertised to the tourists. Crucial for this discussion is that the theater is presented as an institution which occupies a social space connecting inside and outside. That is to say, the symbolic space of performance, the auditorium, is inextricably linked to the political space of the city and then to the rest of the world by way of the audience. In turn, the audience becomes a collective actor who transduces sociocultural content from the theater to the cafe and to the square and back to the theater. Moreover, in the specific historical and geopolitical instance, the audience is subjectified into the public. The public here is the pivot between a collectivity addressed by opera and a collectivity acting in the urban space. And this is the section where Fontana asks, and what about the public? The public as well, all in all, has no reason to congratulate itself, and so forth. The La Scala public may as well take pride in its tradition. Nowadays, such argument is risible, and so forth. And then he describes the public, and you have at the first line, the elders, and then you keep going. Next line, the ladies, the young gentlemen, and then the journalists, and the musicians, and so forth, and they're all criticized, right, just sort of with this ironic voice. And then at the end, the second paragraph there, on the top, the gallery. That's called Lubione, which I think is a Milanese term for logione, source. The logione, for me, the gallery, for me, paradise, right? For me, is still the best part of the La Scala public. The theater, I think, is more an art for the people than for others. The people have a specific trait. They cannot themselves create a beautiful thing, but when they find one, at least 7 times out of 10, and especially in our southern towns, they spring up and shout bravo unreservedly. But the people at least, and this is another trait, if they don't understand beauty of the first order, become downhearted, and so forth. And so in his voice, is sort of the good people of the gallery of La Scala now ruminate the big spectacles that have been dished out. So when they don't understand, they keep thinking, right? There's this image of. So the tone here takes on the typical condescending detachment of a guidebook describing natives' costumes, and yet there is no doubt that for the critic, the public is integral to the Milanese theatrical heritage. Its history and tradition, and then its picturesque traits, are the supplement to what happens on the stage. Moreover, for Fontana, it is the people, in the sense of a lower social class inhabiting the higher tier of the theater, who are endowed with the gift of enthusiasm, and even more so in southern theaters. The audience is firmly established as interlocutor, but its power remains mysterious and therefore in need of containment. Containment here is found in the rhetoric of infantilization and exoticization of the folk vignette, soon to be institutionalized in the nascent discipline of ethnography. In sum, on the one hand, bourgeois public is caught at a cafe while discussing programming and casting, and therefore constitutes that external-internal actor in dialogue with the impresa, with the production, and capable of specifying the demand of the public. On the other, it is the lower classes who are tasked with the expression of unfettered emotional reaction, who are deemed capable of enthusing. All in all, this collective is not only individualized in terms of social status, but also crucially, it is hardly ever passive. Even the patient awaiting of the logione of the gallery in front of an incomprehensible novelty is an action that has the force of shaping the relation with the event, with the work on stage. and of course reminds of other descriptions of the famously immense political power of the crowds. In an article in Il Teatro Illustrato entitled The Taste of the Public, Vittorio Berzezio tries to come to terms with the idea of public taste or taste of the public, and ends up wondering if a singular collective is even capable of having taste. To him, neither past publics nor present ones could form and express sincere opinions, that's the term he uses, a faculty endowed only to singular individuals. So what Berzezio is tackling here is the issue of individuation. One of the reasons why the audience, the public, is unfathomable is because of this relation between the totality, the collectivity, and the individual. So individuation, also the dialectic between multiple singularities, divided and united as they encounter the event of opera. What Berzezio deplores in this essay is the impossibility of legitimizing individual affect as sincere within a collective affective economy such as that of the public. So this is actually a problem that has been explored a lot of recent. So it is as if the enigmatic force of the multitude has to morph by giving voice to singularity, individualized as appassionati d'opera, as opera fans. If the public is a collective mediated by the event of opera, one of the most remarkable traits of fans is their emotional investment in the performers. In the 1902 memoirs of a prompter, Monaldi imagines a fictional prompter being instructed by a prima donna on the functioning of organized clerks, on the shady figures of paid assicuratori insurers, and so forth. But the prompter's indignation for the well-established practice is met by rebuttal. The singer protests that the prompter, hidden in his hall, turning his back to the auditorium, has no idea. And this is a translation of a section of this paragraph. You have never felt, she says to the prompter, you have never felt what it means to face the public, to feel the fearsome fascination of those 1,000 eyes staring at you and of as many ears listening to you, and of that mass of extravagant brains who at times are pleased by a dog howling on the stage, while at other times they remain unmoved in front of artists who deliver treasures of vocality and ingenuity. You cannot know what it means what it means not to be applauded when you believe you deserve it. So in what could be taken as a masterful definition of the singer's immaterial labor, connecting the performer with the fan, the prima donna explains that the sincerity of the applause is not what matters. A stake here on the stage is the very fleeting life of the character, of which the fame is but an index. And this is, again, another excerpt. The singer, my dear, has a short-lived fame, and God forbid that such ephemeral glory escapes her. Here on the stage, we live instinctively and burn out that extrinsic life of the character we embody. Then, what if we take the prima donna's argument as the definition of the relation of opera with its fans? As she contends at the end of that paragraph before, the labor of singers, the work for which they are paid, has to do with providing the audience with a pleasurable experience. And she says, pleasure, as you know, is one of the elements of happiness, and therefore it is inestimable, like happiness itself. What terrifies the singer in Monaldi's memoirs is the lack of reaction, lack of the audience. It is silence, the oral index of absence or of indifference, and thus of her ineffective labor. To conclude, I want to explore the yield of this no-relation, as if the power of the audience could be measured by its absence, the experiment of the 21 grams. I'm toying with that idea. What happens if you reduce something to smoke, to nothing? How do you measure it? By its absence. So It's a different plane.
Attenzione, attenzione, qui vi parla la BBC, British Broadcasting Corporation, dall'aeroporto di Croydon, Londra. In questo momento l'apparecchio che da Roma ci porta i famosi
There are no
cantanti italiani
subtitles,
sta per atterrare.
but as you can
Scenderanno
tell,
Maria
it's badly
Caniglia, Tito
synced.
Gobbi e Gino Becchi. Quanto a Beniamino Gigli, siamo informati che giungerà domattina col clipper dall'America.
Cosa succede?
Non hai visto? Io non me la sento di affrontare quella turba di fanatici.
Ma che fanatici! Ma questi sono inglesi, sono flemmatici.
Tanto flemmatici che resteranno lì fino a stanotte. Bella prospettiva. E allora cosa facciamo? Trucchiamoci.
Ma no, vado io. Non ho mai fatto film, non mi riconosceranno.
Prego, signora Caniglia, si accomodi.
Come della città al largo, la 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 la, resta bottega che l'alba è già presto, la 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 la, ah che bel vivere, che bel piacere, che bel piacere, per un barbiere di qualità, di qualità. Ah, bravo Figaro, bravo, bravissimo, bravo! La 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 la.
Sorry, I skipped a little bit. Good point.
Tutti mi chiedono, tutti mi vogliono. Donne ragazzi, vecchie fanciulle, fa la parrucca, presta la barba, fa la sanguiglia, metti il biglietto, tutti mi chiedono, tutti mi vogliono, tutti mi vogliono, tutti mi vogliono, fa la parrucca, metti la barba, metti il biglietto, ehi, Figaro! Figaro, 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 Figaro! Ahimè, che furia, ahimè!
The scene is indeed about fandom, but the humorously unjustified bursting into an aria on the tarmac, the number of shots of the crowds waiting, their gaze, the quick cuts to the airport personnel who are interrupted in their tasks, look all in the same direction, vaguely bemused. And the loose synchronization of the sound with the image of the aria is hardly a novelty for an Italian cinema that had programmatically adopted dubbing, especially in the previous 20 years of fascist cinema. This is 1948, so it's right at the end of the war. And also, there is a sinister aspect of this, the beginning of this scene, right? And the fact that wherever it's positioned now is kind of, and is about a community of Italians in London who are trying to find a way to pay for the reconstruction of a Catholic church in the middle of London. And they use the stars, right? They fly them in. However, the sequence never congeals into a convincing scene of enchanted listening, of affective exchange between the star and his fans. Indeed, the messy photography, botched editing, foreground a medial error, which in turn generates another kind of scene, a scene of absented fandom, perhaps, or better, a scene of fandom surrogacy, where the audience in the cinema, what we presumed was an audience in a cinema, has to become surrogate fans, co-present to the already displaced audio, taking pleasure in the occasion to see the star in a medium shot dressed in a suit while listening to an audio recording they already knew. But the most suggestive illustration of audience as lack is in Ballard. J.G. Ballard, 1960s short story entitled The Sound Sweep. In a world where music is obsolete and has been converted to ultrasonic sounds, which means inaudible, an aging diva, Madame Gioconda, who lives in an empty radio station, is assisted by a sonovac operator, her last fan. Let's see, just a little bit.
The Sound Sweep by J.G. Ballard. By midnight, Madame Gioconda's headache had become intense. All day, the derelict soundstage had reverberated with the endless din of traffic, accelerating across the mid-town flyover. A frenzied babble of horns, brakes and engines that hammered through the empty corridors, making the faded air feel leaden and angry. Exhausting, but at least impersonal, these sounds Madame Gioconda could bear. At dusk, however, when the flyover quietened, they were overlaid by the mysterious clapping of her phantoms, a sourceless applause that rustled down onto the stage from the darkness around her. At first, a few scattered ripples from the front rows, it soon spread to the entire auditorium, mounting to a tumultuous ovation in which she suddenly detected a note of sarcasm, a single shout of derision that drove a spear of pain through her forehead, followed by an uproar of boos and catcalls that filled the tortured air, driving her away towards her couch where she lay gasping, helpless until... A mute since childhood, Mangan had long been a dedicated admirer of Madame Gioconda. Her songs had spoken to him, but since she had fallen from the public eye, they had now both bonded through their loss of voice. Understanding her, Mangan switched on the sonovac and first concentrated on sweeping the walls and ceiling clean, draining away the heavy, depressing underlayer of traffic noises.
And this is the, I have to skip a little bit at the end.
In the alley, Mangan clipped the sonovac to the sound truck. It drained in a few seconds, but he waited longer before returning, keeping up the pretense that Madame Gioconda's phantom audience was real. Of course, the sonovac was always empty, containing only the usual daily detritus. The riotous applause, the jeers and hoots of derision were, he knew, quite imaginary. Figments of Madame Gioconda's world of fantasy. Phantoms from the past of a once great prima donna, dropped by her public and retreated into her imagination, each evening conjuring a dream of being once again adored by a full house at the Metropolitan, a dream that always turned into a nightmare of fiasco and failure. Why she should...
And so forth, you got the point. This is a reading on SoundCloud by Robert Simpson, and I like the fact that because he had some sound design. So, like a nightmarish reversal of Monaldi's prima donna, here the singer is left alone amidst the accumulated ruins of several sets, surrounded by real and imagined sound waste. The applause, so crucial for transducing the affective content between the singer and the fan, that very much desired applause, is now an oral detritus. In Ballard's bleak and brilliant invention, in the absence of music and singing, all that is left of the aesthetic relation, of its emancipatory power and so forth, is an oral delusion of unfaltering appreciation, the reaction to nothing. That's it.
Thank you very much, Alessandra, for a wonderful presentation. So we have time for one, maybe two questions. So just raise your hand and I'll bring the mic to you. Yeah.
Thank you very much. There was so much in that, Alessandra. I think it's more comments than questions. Maybe the idea of taste or the fan. I just wanted to know whether or not you feel like there's a subtle violence about taste to do with... So some of the arguments around determining taste. So looking at casting, for example, so people in cafes debating the casting at La Scala. But then that sort of segued a little bit into more about the voice and the fans. I mean, and I'm thinking, okay, this is quite a leap, but thinking about mouths as well, like so that you've got the kind of torments of dubbing example. So Antonin Artaud's essay on that. So you've got the mouth, the fleshiness of the mouth that isn't meeting the aria. And then challenging someone's taste can seem quite invasive because it's in your body, it's one of the sensory things. But so do you feel like, on balance, it's more about the fandom and the sort of the disappearance of the sound, or do you feel like there's something going on with taste as well as the frenzy of fandom? I don't know if that makes sense as a question.
This is a fantastic question.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. It will take a while, and you're right. It is that real combination of all this, right? And balance sort of pushes the boundary of that option. I like the idea of taste as a form of violence, and it's back to the sense of creating one voice out of many, right? And so in that sense, Berzezio, who was a parliamentarian in the early years of Italian unification, he wrote something that I tried to put my hands on, but maybe it's better not, a 3-volume social novel entitled The Plebes. So it's like the attempt to describe with kind of sort of naturalistic tools, right, and new kind of sociological ones, what the multitude is. And this is a big issue also in terms of the Italian thought, right? Recent philosophical elaborations of this. What does it mean to be a group versus a single person? So taste is right in between these two of manipulation, perhaps. And again, is also right on the verge of an idea of art versus commodity. So where taste could be weaponized, let's say, or used as simply in order to sell, versus taste as expression of the individuality. What you were saying, right, is so personal.
Thank you. So unfortunately, if we want to keep on schedule, we should, of course, thank Alessandra first for a wonderful presentation again, and welcome our next presenter. So while Rogerio does the setup, I'm going to introduce him. So Rogerio is not a stranger to UC Davis. He's been here before. He's part of the UC family. So he's a professor of musicology at UC Riverside. I'm going to get my glasses because I need them. He works with early opera, lute, guitar cultures, and the Atlantic circulation of musicians and repertoires, with a special interest on cultural exchanges and reconfiguration. Current research focuses on experiences of African and Afro-descendant musicians and Italian opera singers in 19th century Brazil and their convergence in abolitionist performances. He has published many books, 4, I think, the last of which is a wonderful book, Opera in the Tropics, from Oxford University Press in 2019, and I personally I can attest how the work of Rogerio has reached beyond the confines of opera studies. I'm not an opera scholar, and I have benefited from your work greatly through our shared interest in the performance and perception of Africanness musically in Brazil. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Juan.
Yeah, but there's much more to say about you. I mean, you have done so many things. I mean, he's currently co-organizing the Cambridge Companion to the Music of Brazil, and he's doing a massive editorial project of which I'm benefiting from. He's revising and expanding the articles on Brazil of the Grove Music Online, and simultaneously with all that, he's also working on a book project tentatively titled Performing Race in Imperial Brazil. So let's welcome Rogerio warmly.
Thank you so much, Juan. Thank you, Pier Paolo, and thank you for your wonderful team for arranging this event. And also thank you, Philip, for printing this. And well, let me go straight here I presented part of this, a large version of this paper I presented last year. This is a segment of that, but I really want to have your feedback on that as well. The 1988 abolition centennial coincided with the adoption of a new democratic constitution in Brazil. Out of the 559 representatives who drafted it, there were only 11 self-identified as Black or Afro-descendants. 4 of them were particularly engaged in defending equality and inclusion for the country's minorities. The Bancada Negra, as they were called, play a key role crafting legislation criminalizing racism and laws facilitating access to education to minorities and protecting the rights of domestic workers and land workers. Yet, in the midst of the centennial commemorations, they stated very clearly that there was nothing to commemorate, as inequality and injustice persisted, a sentiment that was shared by a large section of the population. The inclusion of opera in that context of celebration and protest also stirred controversy. They were competing for government fundings, of course, and those cultural initiatives. However, other initiatives more connected with the Movimento Negro, theater and dance, for example, were not as contemplated. Some considered opera to be too highbrow, others a foreign import too detached from national culture. Intellectuals and cultural producers argued correctly that opera was present in the abolitionist movement of the 1880s, and Brazil's foremost composer, Carlos Gomes, of Black and indigenous ancestry, even composed an abolitionist opera, Los Schiavo. The problem with this opera was that the original idea for its storyline, which involved African slavery in 19th century Brazil, was modified by influence of the editor, Giulio Ricordi, and the librettist Rodolfo Paravicini, and transformed into a story about indigenous enslavement in the 16th century, maybe to repeat the success of Gomes' previous opera, Il Guarani. In order to resonate with the centennial celebrations in 1988, part of that original idea was restored in terms of ethnicity, location, time frame, and costume design. However, the text remained the same. Los Schiavo was then produced and nationally broadcast by the public television channel TV Educativa, with Black singers in the 2 main roles and the chorus. Both the concept and the production were met with the resistance by music critics, as I've discussed in a long version of this paper, as I mentioned. A second opera, Aida, which is my topic for today, did not make it to the official celebrations, but was also perceived and pitched as abolitionist, thanks to events that took place 100 years earlier. You have 2 ads, one of them, the first one, with the famous baptism of Toscanini as a conductor, and the second one, 6 weeks later, Nadina Bulichov's Festa Artística. It was the novelist Guilherme de Figueiredo, brother of the previous president, who tried to convince Franco Zeffirelli to produce an operatic abolitionist movie in preparation for the centennial, based on a production of Aida in Rio in 1886 with Toscanini at the baton. Zeffirelli liked the idea, and in 1987, he investigated possible places for shooting the movie around the country. But after breaking up with Figueiredo, he filmed it in Tunisia, Italy, and Portugal. Figueiredo sued him, but that's another story. It's quite telling that in Zeffirelli's narrative, the 1886 production was the catalyst for the events that would culminate in the abolition in 1888. Now, let me play you a passage of that movie, highlighting that specific Zeffirelli's rendition of that specific performance in 1886. I'm going to play 3 or 4 minutes of this.
Ora me chiedi quanto più bravi, nulla te negato sarà in tal dì. Non c'è d'infria che innanzi a te si entratti prigioniere.
Your Imperial Highnesses, ladies and gentlemen, Maestro, forgive me. We are here to listen to an opera about slavery. You came to be swept away by the sublime music of Verdi. But as someone pointed out to me, there are things that are even more important than music. Slavery is one of them. And we must do something about it. I want to help by donating this ring. It is a most treasured and beloved gift from someone I love and admire. But tonight, I am donating it to the Organization for the Abolition of Slavery. As of this moment, I have set free my own slaves.
The caption that I showed before. The screening of Young Toscanini in the 1988 Venice Film Festival was met with booing, laughter, and a couple of tomatoes. The audience was already expecting exaggeration. After all, it was a Zeffirelli production. But the scene with Elizabeth Taylor playing Aida in blackface, actually quite historically accurate. However, demanding that the Brazilian emperor ended slavery and apparently being successful at it was particularly unsettling. The audience's reaction was also an answer to Zeffirelli's vicious campaign against Scorsese's The Last Temptation of Christ, screened at the same festival. Even after a public apology, Zeffirelli failed to get an US distributor, which was a death blow for a high-budget independent production back in the 80s. Biographical movies are tedious and hard to make, Zeffirelli confessed. Young Toscanini alternates between reality and fiction, mixes up the timeline, ignores some key figures, fabricates others, and often condenses multiple events in just one single scene, just like so many operas. The strategies here are often necessary in order to make the movie acceptable to Hollywood distributors, because they wanted to stick to the so-called high concept, a clear, simple, and believable premise that runs through the film, and that can be summarized in one sentence, the logline. The Zeffirelli screenwriter, William Stadium, explained how he pitched the movie. The Graduate in Rio in 1880, in which Mrs. Robinson was a famous La Scala diva living in Rio as the mistress of the Brazilian emperor. Young Toscanini, then an itinerant musician, became her vocal coach / lover, as well as her conscience. As a student radical, he was appalled that Brazil still had slavery, and he used his affair to convince her to convince the emperor to free the slaves, which was done during a performance of Aida, with all its Egyptian slaves on the stage. It was totally strange, but all true. And it was the antithesis of Hollywood's high concept. You could hardly sum it one page, much less a phrase. Most of these statements are false or highly distorted, not because of any lack of research by Zeffirelli, because he knew perfectly well the actual facts. These were his choices. His goal, it became clear, was to emphasize the narrative of an European hero, spreading civilization among the savages. Economical wealthy savages, it seems, but cultural savages. At least 2 log lines for Young Toscanini appeared years later, one at Rotten Tomatoes and the other one at the Internet Movie Database. None was able to capture in a single statement or log line the 3 elements Stadium clearly mentioned: the maestro, the diva, and slavery. At the festival's press conference with Zeffirelli, journalist Caio Túlio Costa accused him of falsifying Brazilian history and creating a parallel narrative of the abolition. Zeffirelli answered that Costa did not know the history of his own country, which, to be fair, was partly true. After the interview, Costa wrote in the Folha de São Paulo, "Any person in the world who does not have the slightest idea about Brazil, seeing this movie will believe that Toscanini and the opera singer Bolitschov, portraying the movie as the mistress of the emperor, freed the slaves in Brazil." Between these lines, you can see the perfect log line there. A debuting Italian conductor and a Russian prima donna, and slavery in Brazil. By denying local agency, Zeffirelli struck a nerve. The country was riding, in 1988, a wave of optimism. Democracy had been restored after decades of military rule, and in spite of inflation, Brazil had the world's 7th highest GDP in absolute numbers, and a new progressive constitution. On top of that, the exchange between Zeffirelli and the journalists happened around September 7th, Independence Day, not a good time to disenfranchise national heroes, like Princess Isabel, who signed the abolition proclamation. Realizing that he was on the verge of losing an important market, Zeffirelli called the Brazilian journalist on the next day for a private, conciliatory conversation. "The movie," he said, "is a fable of my own, supported by some moments of true story. It should not be taken as a reality, it's a fantasy." But there was more to it. While creating a fantasy, Zeffirelli also hinted at a current and well-known controversy, as narrated by Arthur Dapiv, a journalist, Arthur Dapiv from Jornal do Brasil. According to him, Elizabeth Taylor only accepted the role because of the bizarre final speech, or you saw part of it. The Hemi actress wanted to be engaged, like the artist who spoke against apartheid. In Zeffirelli's optics, Bolitschov was Jane Fonda, what Jane Fonda is today. So here we have Aida, an Ethiopian enslaved girl in the Old Kingdom of Egypt, representing the enslaving of Sudanese people around the time of its premiere in the 19th century, and a metaphor for 19th century enslaving of Afro-descendants and Africans in Brazil, and a metaphor for 20th century South Africa black segregation. Elizabeth Taylor's speech is ambiguous enough to allow the last interpretation even. When she says that if they help them, the part that I cut, if they help them, perhaps they will forgive the injustices of the past. Actually, it's there. Perhaps they will forgive the injustices of the past. Her words could be addressing both elites in Brazil in the 1880s and in the 1980s, and in South Africa in the 1980s. The Russian diva Nadina Bolitschov never made that speech. She did not enslave any person, and she was not the emperor's mistress. Those are the fantasy moments in the movie. Yet, she did deliver freedom letters to 6 enslaved women during a staging of Aida, with the emperor in the audience and Toscanini at the baton. It was not the evening of Toscanini's debut, though, but 6 weeks later. Young Toscanini and the historical facts is misconstrued bring another layer of meaning to Ralph Locke's 9 readings of Empire in Aida. Aida in Rio seems to conform with his 8th reading, ancient Egypt as, quote, a symbol for any European imperialist ventures outside of Europe, end quote. After all, Brazilian abolitionists saw slavery as a product of European colonialism, and Aida as a symbol for contemporaneous enslaved women in the country. However, as Edward Said demonstrated, Aida is more than a symbol. Locke himself explains. Said urges that Aida is not so much about, but of imperial domination. This is to say, the opera is less a comment on or portrayal of the region and its peoples than is it one manifestation of or instance of imperialism's concrete and conceptual / ideological network of knowledge systems. Said was referring to the circumstances of Aida's first production, being commissioned by the Khedive, or Viceroy of Egypt, and first performed at the Cairo Opera House. With this backdrop, and thinking about Zeffirelli's production, the criticisms of journalists Caio Tulio Costa and Arthur Dapiv about Zeffirelli's movie assume a striking dimension. It is not the whining of naive nationalists unaware of the history of their own country, but the legitimate criticism of journalists concerned with cultural imperialism and its networks, spaces, venues, and agents during the twilight of the Cold War. For Costa and Dapiv, young Toscanini was a clear manifestation of imperial power. Theater was a privileged space for Brazilian abolitionist societies to hold their meetings. The more elaborate ones, often called abolitionist matinees, featured opera overtures and blues arias, instrumental numbers, theatrical scenes, and poetry readings, in addition to abolitionist speeches. By José do Patrocínio gave several of these. He was a frequent presence. And another abolitionist, André Rebouças, published long reviews in the newspapers. We cannot understate the importance of these two abolitionists in the production, in the conception of those events, and later in the reviews in the newspapers. This was a phenomenon known as the theatricalization of politics, an expression coined by historians over the past 20 years. During this phase of the abolitionist movement, journalists, lawyers, and politicians shared the stage with opera singers, instrumentalists, and actors to convey a message of social change. They articulated a rhetoric of empathy, hope, guilt, and shame, and moving the subjects to embrace the campaign and fight for change. Opera and opera artists energized and hailed subjects to join the cause, an interpellation, to use Althusser's concept, enabling subjects to assume an abolitionist identity. The participation of national and foreign artists, along with influential amateurs, would give symbolic support, attract donors, and influence public opinion. However, contractual obligations and the short stay of visiting artists made it difficult for them to persuade the top prima donne to participate in those events, but not impossible. The interpellation process was crucial. As they gained their sympathy, they would ask permission to join them at their own benefit concert, the Festa Artística, which would happen usually at the end of each season. They would negotiate the purchase of a number of freedom letters to specific individuals and set up a performance within the performance in which the prima donna would deliver one or more freedom letters directly to those individuals on stage, embracing and kissing them, and giving visibility and legitimacy to the campaign. This happened in July 1881 in Recife, Pernambuco, when Catalan singer Josefina Senespleda Batalha invited the Abolitionist Society to her own Festa Artística, when she delivered a freedom letter to the 16-year-old girl, Maria Rosalina, as described in the commemorative number of the periodical A Lira. This performance was intended to happen 2 months earlier, but her impresario first prevented her from doing so, which prompted a riot in front of the hotel where he was lodged and the publication of the pamphlet, which placed another pamphlet, not this one, which placed the population against him. And he finally conceded. The Italian soprano Lucia Avalli participated in abolitionist matinees in Rio, both as a singer and a violinist, before touring the northern provinces. On October 18, 1883, evening of her own benefit at the Teatro Santa Isabel in Recife, after the second act of Donizete Spoliuto, the Clube Abolicionista stepped on stage to deliver a speech and offer freedom letters to 2 young enslaved women, which were delivered by the prima donna. Newspapers described how this gesture moved the audience and the artist herself to tears, while adding splendor to the event, illustrating that abolitionist sentimental rhetoric. These precedents provide context to the events that unfolded on August 10, 1886, evening of the Festa Artística of Russian prima donna Nadina Bulichov, when she handed freedom letters to 6 women. There was a 7th one later, also who received it later. Amidst hugs and kisses, right after the 3rd act of Aida. This was not an improvised gesture, but a carefully planned performance, instigated by and produced with the help of the Abolitionist Confederation, particularly José do Patrocínio. It was even announced in Rio's newspapers 2 days before the concert. Knowing that her fans were collecting funds to buy her expensive gifts for their event, as was usual for the Festa Artística, she asked them to give that money to the Abolitionist Confederation instead. In the end, she also received the gifts, and the Abolitionist Confederation was able to buy those 7 freedom letters. Later that week, Angelo Agostini published in his Revista Ilustrada this famous illustration depicting the climatic movement, in which you have Patrocínio explaining what's going on stage, and then you have Nadina Bulichov there kissing the 6 women, and Toscanini at the baton. Music critic Oscar Guanabarino described this moment in very emotional terms. As soon as the third act area was over, a wind band stepped on stage, and our colleague José do Patrocínio presented the 7 slaves who, under an indescribable delirium of clapping, cheering, poems, pigeons, flowers, and the sound of the national anthem, received by Miss Bulissiov's hands their ladders, having the people as their witnesses, standing up and waving their handkerchiefs. And he kept on, making all sorts of parallels between the opera, the plot of the opera, and the celebration, contrasting the Egyptian trumpets with the wind band playing the anthem, contrasting the fate of the actual character in the opera with the liberating gesture of this artist, and so on. Giving a speech on a follow-up event 1 week later, José do Patrocínio again made sure that the audience understood the connection between opera and reality, art and life. Aida, he said, who faced all dangers to confess her love, left the stage, stepped down the scene, and came to the bosom of society, one needs to say it, to face all sorts of prejudices to perform a great act of generosity. Now, I understand there is a lot to say about those women, and also the others who were liberated before. They were also part of the performance. They even in that situation, but that's not part of this talk today here. But they are real people, part of that specific performance, who played an important role. And to conclude, for Patrocínio, Bulissiov translated that rhetoric of feelings into concrete action. Translating sentimentality into action was essential for the continuity of the campaign. Now, considering the number of individuals still enslaved in the city and the country, and an isolated act like this seems that doesn't make any dent. However, it was unmatched in terms of publicity, influencing public opinion among the elites, who in turn had the power to influence lawmakers. Brazilian abolitionists in general embraced opera and spoken theater. It provided them with moments of rejoicing, when commemorating a freedom, when imagining a possible better world. They also made sure audiences were aware of the political content of the opera, and invited artists to break the wall that separated them from the audience and from current social battles on the streets. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Rogerio. So we have about 7 minutes for questions. So just raise your hand if you have one. I'll bring the mic to you. Pierre.
Thank you for this well-researched paper revealing aspects of history that I didn't know about. And I wonder, what do you think about the present role of opera in Brazil or elsewhere to invite for action, and not just to, perform cliches maybe of sympathy, but to really drive legislators and the general public to change the world?
Oh, that will be at that time in the 1880s. That will be the case of Lo Schiavo, but that's I didn't have only 20 minutes. but in any case, Lo Schiavo was this opera by Carlos Gomes that one of the abolitionists in the city asked him actually to do that. He provided him a storyline for a possible libretto, and Carlos Gomes was very interested on that. And actually, newspapers of the time, with André Rebouças and others, they commented that Carlos Gomes was about to publish, produce a new opera based on Afro-Brazilian slavery, based on that specific time. So that was the news that they were going on. And commentators, they used that also to compare specific areas were circulating in the city before the premiere of the opera in 1899, after the abolition. and those areas where they were included in those abolitionist events. So a specific opera was composed. However, there was that problem that when you get to the editors in Italy, they nudged him into, are you going to talk about African slavery? Are you sure about that? It's going to be a good, so you think it's going to be a success in Italy like Il Guarani, which Europeans want to see the Indians or the savages. Europeans want to see so that the old stereotype resurfaces. And then he had to change the libretto. That's the one. However, in theater, you also have, not so much in opera, but theater has historically been more connected with specific plays addressing slavery, just like in the US. But really, in terms of an opera composed with a specific political objective in mind, in the 1880s, Lo Schiavo is really the one thing, even though with the altered libretto.
Mm-hmm. To ask you a question, Rogerio. So you started your presentation talking about. Hello. Okay. You started your presentation with a slide with 1988, at the moment when in Brazil they were celebrating the anniversary of abolition, and I was thinking about what was happening in Brazil in this moment with all the revival of African culture, and so. Could you speak a little bit about the perceptions of the genre of opera in this period, and how to carry on with Pierre's question, what was the potential in 1988 of opera to be used as a vehicle for these progressive messages of maybe not abolition, but in this moment of acts of reparation or inclusion of Black population in Brazil?
I would say very, very little, very small. As our colleague just mentioned here just before, that environment is not very, that environment, opera world in Brazil, I don't know if everywhere is like that. But yeah, in Brazil it's exactly like that. Not very welcoming to this type of political message, and especially relating to, you see, you had 554 representatives in the government. 11 of them were Black. And then 4 of them, out of those 11, only 4 of them, they fought to create a new legislation and new laws. And then you have in the cultural domain a similar percentage. So I would not say it was very welcoming. However, that production, the television production, was a landmark. Because you have, I don't remember any other time before of that, you have an opera production targeting or especially inviting black singers to perform the leading roles in an opera production in the country. And not only that, it was televised for national television. Surely that made an impact in the general audience. That impact could be bigger if it wasn't because it was late night on a Saturday that was presented. In that video that I show you some screens there, I have it because someone made a VHS, and then that VHS, now you can buy the CD online, but the TV Educativa doesn't have I was not able to locate that original tape in the archives, but I'm trying to.
Thank you very much. I wish we could continue the conversation, Rogerio, but we need to move on to the next presenter. So thank you very much, Rogerio Budasz. So while our next presenter gets set up, I'm going to read her a summary of her accomplishments. So the next presenter is Professor Jessica Peritz, who is Assistant Professor of Music and Affiliated Faculty in Italian Studies and Early Modern Studies at Yale University. A cultural historian of the long 18th century, she studies the relationships between bodies and politics in Italian opera. Her award-winning book, The Lyric Myth of Voice, Civilizing Song in Enlightenment Italy, was published in 2022 by University of California Press. She has articles published in all the articles of the journals where you very smart people publish on opera studies and musicology. So she's published in all of those. She has won prizes from very prestigious societies, the American Musicological Society, Modern Language Association, and other societies in Italy. Her current book project, entitled Histories Out of Time, reconsiders the assumptions of modern historiography, musical and otherwise, by exploring the pre-Enlightenment notions of history and temporality through Metastasian opera seria. And today's presentation is precisely about that. So let's welcome Jessica.
Thank you so much. So first, I want to say thank you to all of you who are still here. I will endeavor to get through this very dense talk, apologies, so that we can all go eat some dense sandwiches before too long. But I also want to say thank you to Pierre for having me, and to Anushka and Sarah for putting all this together. And it's just been a really lovely time talking with all of you. Okay, so we're ending kind of in not necessarily the beginning, but I'm sort of the one talking about the oldest stuff that we have going on here. So journeying back to the early 18th century, and just as a content warning on the next slide, there will be an image that depicts something like blackface, although as you'll see, it's not what we think of, in the 19th century sense, but I just wanted to put that warning out there so no one's shocked when I change the slide. In a striking caricature from, oh no, it's not letting me, hi, sorry, it's not working. It's stuck. Sorry, everybody. Usually the spacebar makes the slide change, and it's just. I don't know what's happening. It was working 2 seconds ago. Okay, there we go. Thank you. All right. All right. Once more with feeling. In a striking caricature from 1730, star singers Francesca Cuzzoni and Nicola Grimaldi appear in costume for the opera Idaspe. The castrato, whose character dresses as a fake Moor in the opera, is shown here with his face and hands painted black. While this might not seem so surprising to us now, this sketch is very unusual for its time. There are no others that I know of that show dark makeup as part of opera seria costuming. Comic genres, yes. Serious opera, not so much. But whether it's representative of a single isolated situation, it's actually as a gesture to the fakeness of Idaspe's Moorish costume, or if it perhaps reveals that these practices were more widespread than previously thought, the caricature shows that, contrary to common narratives, opera seria indeed has something to tell us about early modern representations of racialized difference. But what opera seria tells us, I suggest, is a bit different from what we already know from other musical and theatrical genres. So sketch aside, my talk today isn't about visual modes of representation. Instead, I'll be considering how poetic language, dramaturgy, and musical idioms projected opera seria's particular but significant construction of racialized difference. I'll focus here on Pietro Metastasio's libretto Catoni and Utica, first set to music by Leonardo da Vinci for Rome in 1728. I'll explain why later on. So this talk is only a very brief distillation of a very long article, so I'm going to be kind of glossing through the major points, but please ask me questions in the Q&A or via email or whatever. I'm happy to expand on anything. So the main problem with unpacking constructions of race from before the late 18th century is that what we now think of as race is historically contingent. It's an ideological product of the European Enlightenment. As Renaissance literary scholar Noémie Ndiaye puts it in her groundbreaking 2022 book, Scripts of Blackness, quote, "Race is a system of power falsely packaged as a system of knowledge, mobilizing the dominant epistemic fields at any given point in time," end quote. The dominant epistemic field that emerged during the Enlightenment, which privileged taxonomizing and naturalizing modes of knowledge, facilitated the 19th century's scientific theories of race, in which difference was held to be biological and essential, at once inscribed on the surface of bodies and embedded within them as structurally immanent. But in earlier periods, difference was understood differently, according to the kinds of knowledge that were possible within then dominant epistemic fields. In the first half of the 18th century, the human body was not yet regarded as a self-enclosed system, but rather as a porous, fluid one, as Greta Lafleur has demonstrated. So difference, whether in regard to race, gender, sexuality, what have you, was not understood as necessarily embedded within bodies. Instead, difference was theorized as a perceptible manifestation of bodies' susceptibility to external factors, from the environmental to the cultural. So in the early decades of the 18th century, difference was presented as potentially flexible. So to be clear, I am not suggesting that the systems of power that operated through these earlier discourse domains were any less harmful than those that operated via later biological constructs of race. Violence is violence, whatever the discourse. For, as performance studies scholar Tavian Young-Oh puts it, race itself is a fiction, but racism is real, being collectively experienced and enacted. So I am critiquing the fiction of race by interrogating aspects of its prehistory. I am not in any way questioning the experiences of people who move through the world in bodies that have been racialized. Just to make that clear. So this is why I'm using the term racialized difference here. I want to flag that we're talking about an earlier epistemic field, because I want to avoid reifying post-Enlightenment concepts of race as though they were universal and natural. But I also want to acknowledge the continuities between those epistemes across time. So to do so, I draw the notion of racialism from Cedric Robinson's foundational study, Black Marxism, where he uses racialism as an umbrella term for various ideological processes of differentiation across the history of European civilization, from Greco-Roman antiquity through global capitalist modernity. The genre of opera seria has by and large been treated separately from these concerns. This is because opera seria typically deals in universalizing abstractions rather than in the localized particularities typically associated with comic genres. What this means is that seria libretti and their musical settings mostly lack so-called exoticisms. But exoticism is concerned with surface features, and I'm interested in what was happening on a structural level. Race is a system of power, as Njaye puts it, and the genre of opera seria was devoted to exploring issues of power, as Martha Feldman has shown. Metastasio's operas in particular explored power relations through scenarios set in imperial and colonial contexts borrowed from Greco-Roman history. They ratified the tenets of good sovereignty in the 18th century by staging past encounters between Greco-Roman Europeans and African or Asian others. So what I'm proposing is simple. Some of these common Metastasian scenarios, as well as the poetic conventions embedded within them, initially functioned as techniques for representing the power relations of difference. But crucially, difference as it was understood within the bounds of the epistemic field within which Metastasio was writing. So Catoni and Utica is a useful case study here for two reasons. One, it revolves around the issue of marking differences between imperial subjects, namely, defining who counts as a true Roman. Two, the libretto is both early and experimental, so it shows Metastasio developing his major modus operandi, which was giving opera-goers the romantic intrigues they desired, but investing those emotional conflicts with monumental implications worthy of tragedy. So the opera maps the larger-than-life political dilemmas of empire onto the interpersonal relationships between the denizens of that empire. So a little plot synopsis, since this is probably not anyone's best-known Metastasian libretto. The year is 46 BCE. We're in the ancient Roman colony of Utica, now Tunisia in North Africa, where two Roman political leaders are waging an ideological war over Rome's future. Can an empire be run by a republican government at home, as the Stoic senator Catone believes? Or does empire require absolutist rule, as the would-be dictator Giulio Cesare maintains? Keep in mind here that Cato's Rome was not just a republic, but also an empire, having had colonies in North Africa dating back centuries. This was about what type of government was best for the Romans at home who benefited from that empire, and not about the prospect of empire in general. So the North African soil on which they fight is a proxy for Rome itself, as is the body of Marzia, Catone's daughter and Cesare's secret lover. So the character who interests me most here is Arbace, a young Numidian prince who's also in love with Marzia and allies himself with Catone, thus creating the opera's central love triangle. The opera ends, in its original version, with Cesare's victory and Catone's suicide. Catone explains, "I am teaching the world and all of you how to avoid slavery." His dying command is that Marzia renounce her beloved Cesare and pledge eternal faith to Arbace instead. Marzia agrees, and lying in his daughter's arms, Catone says to her, "I never thought to leave you in Africa like this." He dies. Cesare is filled with remorse and throws his victor's laurels on the ground. Because Cesare has expressed an inner conflict about his divinely ordained duty to take over Rome, he's conveniently exonerated from charges of tyranny. The end. So this libretto is more Julius Caesar fan fiction than history. The events of Caesar's civil war were most famously recounted by Plutarch and Lucan, both of whose classical texts Metastasio knew very well. But in the libretto's argumento, he was uncharacteristically evasive about his sources. He cited simply history, because admitting his real inspiration would have rankled the classicist establishment in Rome. The clue to that inspiration is his character Arbace, who doesn't appear in any classical sources, because he's not a historical figure. This sentimental African prince comes instead from a contemporary English play, one that literary scholar Julie Ellison has dubbed the most politicized drama of the 18th century. That play was Cato by Joseph Addison, and it premiered in London in 1713. It was performed well into the 19th century, not only in England, but in the North American colonies too. Ask me about that later. Metastasio couldn't read English, but he didn't need to. Already by 1720, there were at least 6 published Italian translations floating around. So the character that Metastasio calls Arbace was Addison's invention. In the English tragedy, Marcia's African lover is named Juba. He's a fictional composite of several real historical figures. We know that Metastasio's Arbace is Addison's Juba because the libretto explains that the poet changed the name to accommodate musical setting. The source matters. And it matters because it reveals that Metastasio's Arbace retains many of the resonances of Addison's Juba. And Juba's central role in Addison's play is inextricable from contemporary constructions of racialized difference vis-a-vis empire. In brief, Addison wrote the play for the London public during the ascent of British colonialism, made possible by the trafficking and enslavement of Africans and the plantation economy in the Americas. Addison's play thus hinges on the question of how the project of empire should be framed. Addison's Juba is crucial in this. Over the course of the drama, the African prince follows Cato's example and successfully cultivates for himself, quote, a Roman soul. Through Juba's arc, including his famous speech from early on in the play here, Addison presented the purpose of empire as, quote, civilizing the colonized in the colonizer's mold. The color of one's skin still signifies Romanness or Africanness in the play. Marcia is described as, quote, one of the pale, unripened beauties of the north, while Juba is, quote, one of Numidia's tawny sons. Yet both skin color and origins are ultimately portrayed as secondary to one's behavior. This is why Cato's last act in the play is to obliquely affirm Juba as a Roman and permit him to marry Marcia. The play's early 18th century British imperialist ideology required that racialized difference be at once clearly visible and conveniently mutable. It's important to note here that Juba's Africanness is portrayed as mutable because it is also portrayed as liminal. For one thing, he's a prince, and his elite class status made him more legible and thus more sympathetic to audiences, as an iteration of what literary scholar Laura Brown calls the native prince trope. But more than that, Juba is situated both chromatically and geographically between sub-Saharan Africa, the Levant, and Mediterranean Europe. His flexibility thus places him within what Felicity Nussbaum calls, quote, the unassimilated space between Blacks so-called and Orientals in the early 18th century European imaginary. So Addison and Metastasio each represented racialized difference by updating classical frameworks to accommodate their contemporary aims. As both would have known from the canonical ancient sources I mentioned earlier, social identities in ancient Rome were typically defined according to multiple intersecting factors, but especially by the presence or absence of different types of control. So the lack of legal control over one's own body meant one was enslaved, and thus by Rome's definition, not a Roman citizen. The lack of physical control over one's own body, including an inability to regulate one's emotions and behavior, meant one was not fully a man and thus not a Roman citizen. As Latin scholar Robert Cowan has argued, Lucan drew on such definitions in characterizing Romans and their others in his epic Pharsalia. There, Roman masculinity is embodied by the Stoic Cato, while its negation is embodied by the various North African and Eastern figures whom Lucan portrayed as effeminate and puerile because lacking the physical and emotional self-control that connoted Roman masculinity. Metastasio modernized this ancient identity matrix in Catonian Utica by reconciling it with his own 18th century framework of Cartesian dualism. As many others have shown in detail, Metastasio is very into Descartes. So run through his Cartesian framework, the distinction between Roman and African becomes a distinction between self-control or self-sovereignty and the lack of it. But the disjunct between ancient Roman values like Lucan's and those of Metastasio's own day meant that Cato's famous Stoicism seemed overly harsh. This is why Caesar appears in the opera, despite not being in Addison's play. Metastasio needed a character to model Roman masculinity according to Cartesian principles. Unlike, the slide did not change properly. Okay. Unlike Catone, Cesare experiences a full range of Cartesian passions from the ugly to the tender, and in good Cartesian fashion, Cesare successfully manages how he reacts to those passions by using his reason. So in the opera, it is Cesare and not Catone who can show Arbace what it means to be a Roman. Significantly, Metastasio's libretto defines Romanness much like the ancient sources did, by opposing self-sovereignty to enslavement. So on one level, this is a political metaphor that was borrowed from Roman antiquity, and it was used to critique non-republican government by calling it tyranny. Don't worry about the wall of text, but early on in Act 2, Catone calls the senators who support Cesare's dictatorship, quote, the vilest herd of slaves, then sings an aria in which he opposes Roman virtue to the shame of slavery's vile yoke, repeating the lines, do not say you are a Roman so long as you live in servitude. Slavery and servitude, which Metastasio uses interchangeably in the libretto, function as metonyms for this lack of self-sovereignty, not only politically, but emotionally too. This is how Metastasio exonerated Cesare the tyrant. The poet applied Cartesian terms to what had been a fundamental tenet of European thought since at least the 16th century, as the distinction between rational self-control and enslavement to one's passions. As decolonial theorist Sylvia Wynter argues, the notion of enslavement became essential to definitions of man and other across early modernity. Renaissance humanist intellectuals sought a way to define alternative modes of being human without relying on the Christian premise of mankind's enslavement to original sin. Humanist thinkers therefore secularized that metaphorical enslaver from original sin into, quote, the irrational and particularistic desires of one's human nature. One who was enslaved to one's passions remained marked as other, while man was he who could, quote, subdue his private interests in order to adhere to the laws of the politically absolute state. Cesare is clearly the exemplar of man, according to this rubric. Wynter pointedly repeats the word enslavement to describe this moral ethical construct. For, as she goes on to demonstrate, the metaphorical concept of emotional enslavement quickly became justification for the very real colonization of the Americas, the mass enslavement of Africans, and the reformulation of human variety into race. So it's no coincidence that this mode of un-Roman servitude, emotional enslavement, is the one projected onto Arbace. As the other characters constantly remind him, he is both African and unable to practice moderation when it comes to his love for Marzia. This framing of Arbace's enslavement as a foil to Cesare's self-sovereignty becomes most apparent in Act 2. So an opera seria has 3 acts. So, for example, right after Catone's aria in which he opposes Romanness to servitude, Marzia encourages Arbace to pursue an African woman instead of her own Roman self by telling him, quote, "I set you free." But Arbace refuses his freedom with the tender aria "So che pietà non hai," which is full of courtly love tropes. We won't talk about it or unfortunately listen to it here, but it's sort of very typical sentimental gallant style. That Arbace is the overly sentimental other to the true Roman Cesare is brought out by the fact that these two roles were always composed for castrati, while all the other roles varied. But what is more, Cesare's two arias in the same act foreground his power, both martial and musical. In his first aria, he compares himself to a sea resisting the whims of an angry wind, and in the second one, excerpted here on the slide, he threatens Cato on the battlefield. Vinci's settings of these two arias for the castrato virtuoso Giovanni Canestini feature extensive hammering fioritura, heroic brass. It's very different from Arbace's musical idiom. So I would love to play the music, but in the interest of time, I think I'm going to not. But if anyone wants to hear it, I can send you links to the recordings later on. It's very flashy, it's very impressive, it's sort of quite bombastic. So, following Cesare's display, Arbace's alterity is put center stage in the final scenes of Act 2. First, the secondary character Emilia rebukes Arbace for his sentimental servitude with more metaphors of enslavement, urging him to, quote, "free his heart from its chains and seek for liberty." She then leaves him on stage alone for the climactic closing scene of the act. This sort of final aria of the second act was like the big emotional moment in an opera seria. After a accompanied recitative, which underlines his elite class status, he sings a deeply pathetic aria in which he describes the feeling of jealousy as ice in the midst of fire. So this is very Petrarchan. In early modernity, this and other common Petrarchan tropes were often used in connection with male North African figures who desired pale-skinned women, both within Petrarch's own poetic corpus, as Aisha Ramachandran has shown, and on the Baroque stage, as Noemi Njaya has argued. The aria also, of course, uses this recurring metaphor of tyranny to once again elide the passions in politics. Crucially, however, despite his poetic language, Arbace says he feels these things but cannot explain them. We are told he is unable to rationalize his emotions like a good Cartesian subject. And in Vinci's setting, the style, this is in all of Arbace's arias, it's sweetly sentimental. You have these sort of sobbing Lombard rhythms, these sighing appoggiaturas, et cetera, et cetera. So we won't listen to it, but take my word for it. So this pivotal second act concludes with this extended expression of all-consuming feeling. This scene lasts for nearly 10 minutes. Really, there is a spotlight on this beautiful, luxurious singing, ironically, really inviting the audience to luxuriate in this scene of sentimental enslavement. In Act 3, however, Arbace begins to change, thanks to Cesare's example, of course. At a critical moment in the plot, the Roman general puts his moral duty above his private desires, which inspires Arbace's admiration. So now, for the very first time, the prince tries to reconcile his own feelings with a sense of duty. And crucially, he does so in the language of not servitude and not sentiment, but battle. Combattuta, embattled. Metastasian may have taken inspiration here from a famous scene in Addison's play, in which an evil Roman senator disguises himself as Juba to sneak into Marcia's room. To save her, the real Juba has to battle this false black-faced version of himself, dramatizing Juba's own internal struggle between his Roman soul and his African exterior. In the opera, Metastasio's bellicose language and Vinci's rousing setting convert Addison's Juba versus Juba duel into heroic song. This is also the first and only time that Arbace sings in a musical idiom like Cesare's heroic one. He even tells Cesare in the B section, "You set me free." So as we won't hear, the rhythmic accompaniment is intense and driving. There's rapid fioritura, there's big registral leaps, all this sort of, this is the castrato moment sort of coming into himself. All right, almost done. So the opera's central proposal, that Romanness is the antithesis of enslavement, is proclaimed once again by Cesare himself in the very next scene. In accompanied recitative, Cesare commands his emotions to be silent if they cannot serve a nobler desire, that is, his political duty. In the ensuing aria, he explains why one must exercise control over one's feelings, because emotional servitude damages one's sense of reason. In this, the final aria of the entire opera, Cesare affirms that the real tyranny is letting one's feelings dominate one's reason. So, this moral became foundational for Metastasian opera writ large. And yet, in this early libretto, based on a contemporary play about empire, coloniality, and racialized difference, the conventional moral isn't so cordoned off from reality. After all, when Metastasio wrote Catone, it was barely 15 years after the Peace of Utrecht had granted Britain complete control over the transatlantic slave trade, signaling a decisive shift from the Mediterranean to the Atlantic as the axis of global economic and political power. In this context, Metastasio's representation of Romanness offered his Roman audience a reminder that the Roman Empire, and not the British, had been the original divinely ordained civilizer of the world. Catone in Utica exemplifies how racialized difference was mapped onto a Cartesian framework for reasons at once dramaturgical and political. Arbace's racialization renders him a safe container for the threat that unrestrained sentiment posed to the absolutist political order of opera seria. Yet at the same time, the transitivity of his racialized difference indicates the desire for such alterity to be assimilated into and even effaced by the very order it was once meant to oppositionally define. Simply, if Cesare emblematizes a fantasy of the once and future Roman Empire, then the sentimental African prince with a Roman soul embodies the twinned precarity and potentiality of an 18th century Italy that had long since lost its empire and become the colonies in Europe's own backyard. Indeed, both figures, the king and the prince, would replay these roles in endlessly reimagined guises across the vast geographical dominion of Metastasian opera seria. That is, up until the very end of the 18th century, when racialisms had conceptually ossified into race, and human variety was mapped geographically onto the unidirectional trajectory of Hegelian universal history. Altogether, foreclosing further repetitions of opera seria's recursive drama of racial transitivity and sentimental surrogation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jessica. That was a fascinating presentation. Pierre, we are over time, but do we have time for a question? Okay, so we have time for one, maybe two short questions. Ali.
First, thanks for the wonderful presentation. It was a very interesting topic. I wanted to know, do you think there was a connection between, probably Metastasio knew Shakespeare's Othello by that time, and since we have a person like a black-skinned, or like let's say dark-skinned person, who is shuffled among royalty somehow and is still having his own inner struggles to stabilize himself among them. Do you think there is a connection between them? They probably knew, Shakespeare didn't know Metastasio, but Metastasio knew Shakespeare probably, right?
It's a good question because the 18th century is really when you start getting a lot of translations of Shakespeare because Metastasio, couldn't read English. But actually the lineage is yes, the genealogy does go back through Othello, not Othello, Othello. And it's partly because where Addison got Juba from, right? He's the one who sort of inserted this character into history, this sentimental figure. And he actually probably got it from the stage play version of Afra Bain's novel Orinoco, which is called Orinoco or The Royal Slave, really important novel from the end of the 17th century that was soon turned into a very popular English stage play. And so that in Orinoco, she's also drawing on Othello, as was Thomas Southern, who did the stage adaptation. There's a whole sort of backstory on that I won't get into. So I don't know that Metastasio knew Othello or that he was sort of consciously thinking of that. But if you trace Metastasio to Addison, Addison back to Southern, and Southern back to Afra Bain, the Othello figure is sort of in all of that, but in a very different way, and that this particular sort of native prince trope figure is always this sort of sentimental surrogate, both in English heroic drama and also, I'm arguing, in Metastasian opera. So his function is different than somebody like Othello in that he's sort of not, he's never the lead, he's always sort of the side character who is fulfilling a different kind of function. But the connection is absolutely there. Thank you for that question.
Hi, thank you for such a really fascinating, this really helps us understand how to see Blackness earlier and earlier on. Just a really quick moment, I don't know, so Shakespeare was translated into Italian in the 18th century?
Yeah, but later, somebody else might know more than me, but I don't think Metastasio.
I'm wondering if you knew the Cinthio, which is what, the Cinthio, of which Shakespeare's Othello is based on. And that, I just looked that up, and that's from 1565.
Yes, right,
and that was, the Un Capitano Moro. So it could be, he got this, Metastasio was familiar with the source that Shakespeare was interested in. Still, just a quick question, and thank you for all this. So this name, Arbace, that is such a common name.
It is such a common name. It is Metastasio's favorite name for like the sentimental prince figure. So there's always an Arbace.
Yes, right. So could Arbace have this Juba connection?
Yes.
Oh my gosh,
absolutely.
That's huge.
Absolutely. And so what's actually interesting here is, so the two Jubas, like in my title, could be referring to lots and lots of things, which is sort of the deal. But
almost Albrecht Licht and Albrecht Schwarze, you know, with Cesare. I mean, that's
absolutely. And also, there's a whole sort of side narrative through this about padding Juba as well, and how that actually, in many people in the 19th century thought that that came from Addison's character Juba, which is not, I mean, actually comes from Juba, like D-J-O-U-B-A, but people in the 19th century assumed that it came through Addison, which is like, okay. But what's interesting is that Metastasio's previous libretto, 1724, Di Donna Abbandonata, the sort of evil African prince is named, well, he's not actually named Arbace, but he uses the pseudonym Arbace. And so he's this evil Arbace, and then you have this big flip into the next libretto, which is Catone. And so I think something happened in there, because what he's doing in Didone, which I won't get into here because we don't have time, we're all hungry, is something quite different from what he starts doing from Catone onwards, which is why I'm not saying every opera by Metastasio is about racialized difference, but I think that adapting Addison and using and trying to figure out how to use that for his own dramaturgical and political ends kind of made a blueprint for the operas that followed. And so the fact that Arbace is a name that keeps coming back, it's easy to sing, right? I mean, Arbace is easier than Juba, which is a little harder. I don't think so, but I mean, this is what people claim.
Where did Addison get the name? I don't know.
Well, he got it from the historical character, or sorry, the historical figure Juba, who was a client king of Cato's. Okay. But he was not a like handsome young prince. He was like a sort of badass, you know, king who was, you know, buddies with Cato. So it is kind of from history, but also he's totally changed the figure.
So this Arbace is sort of in that 18th century world of having these associations.
Yeah.
Wow, that's really exciting.
Yeah, thank you for those questions. And for the Cinthio reference, that's super helpful.
Okay, well, thank you very much. I think that's all the time we have. So I'm going to pass the microphone to the man of the day. The weekend.
Just 30 seconds. Thank you, Jessica. Thank you very much for this beautiful final paper that shows that opera studies is changing also in for 18th century music and opera. Again, thank you all for being here. I think this was a big success. And I'm especially proud of the emerging scholars. There were a few glitches, there was, well, the weather is okay now that we have the sun, but the copy machine was broken, so not all the handouts came out well, but we will post bios and titles and abstracts for the emerging scholars online. There are free tickets for the concert that starts at 2. Feel free to ask Phil Daly for tickets. You can just go for 2 pieces if you want, 2 arias. I mean, you don't have to stay for the whole time. I hope you will. And I am thankful to Christian Baldini for that. I also want to say hi to all the people who are following us remotely from home. And we feel you are here with us. Again, I am extremely happy with how things went yesterday and today. So thank you very much to all of you. Please have lunch. There is lunch for everybody in this room. You don't need to have spoken or be a presenter. So you can come back here to eat lunch and ask questions or just chat. Okay.